Welcome to the Glenn Mercer Show, where we talk all things vegan. If you're not already vegan, no worries, we'll get you there. If you are, tune in for health advice, information on climate change, and all the damage done by our most destructive industry, animal agriculture. We'll also talk cooking, theater, film, and culture. My 2 reasons for starting this podcast: to entertain, to inform, and to make people vegan. Oh, that's 3. Shit. Welcome to the Glenn Mercer Show. You can find us across all your favorite podcast platforms. You could find us on YouTube, and please remember to subscribe. And you can find us at realmeneatplants.com. My guest today is Cory Davis. He is a licensed professional agrologist, and we're going to try to find out what that is. With over 10 years' experience in natural resource and environmental management, he is co-author of this book, Plant-Powered Protein, along with Visanto Molina and a woman he knows well, Brenda Davis, his mother. And in the book, Cory breaks down the environmental impacts of different protein choices. Cory, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here. Finally get a chance to meet you, albeit virtually.
All right. And you are coming to us from Vancouver Island, is that right?
That is correct.
How long have you lived there?
Vancouver Island. Just about a year now, and I've lived here on and off over the past dozen years or so as well. But my heart brought me back, and so did my wonderful wife.
Okay.
Who chose
this
spot.
And do you have any children?
No.
Okay, well, if you ever do, I would like to immediately have the kid on the show, because I've had your mother on the show. And we are making podcast history today, at least for my podcast, having 2 generations of the Davis family. So as soon as there's a third, I want the kid on the show.
All right, I'll look forward to that. As soon as the kid
can talk, is an expert on anything, I want the kid on the show.
All right, let's do it.
All right. So tell us what an agrologist is.
Yeah, an agrologist is a field of expertise that focuses on the production of food and also the conservation of lands used to grow food. And if you're familiar with the history of North America, for example, all lands, pretty much all habitable lands were used for growing food. And my specialization within the field of agrology is environmental conservation. So from a high level, under the umbrella of agrology, we have soil scientists, we have cattle ranchers, we have all kinds of different fields that hone in on food production, including ecological restoration and so forth. So it's quite a broad field of expertise.
And what made you decide to go into that field?
My passion for food, of course. So from an early age, I realized that the mode of food production in our culture today did not align with my values. It shocked me from a very early age, since I was about 4 years old. And as I grew up, I always reflected on that. And I never wanted to lose that shock value that I experienced when I realized that we eat animals, other living beings.
It is surprising, isn't it?
It is. It's a shock for a child who doesn't expect that. I grew up with books showing family farms where you're feeding the pigs and cows pizza and the part of the family. To have that realization, going to I recall I was about 3 years old, going to a friend's birthday party at McDonald's when my mom, Brenda Davis, pulled over in the parking lot and just let me know that the burgers they serve at McDonald's are not the same as the burgers that we eat at home.
Now, you were still eating burgers at home. Oh, no, you were eting plant
veggie burgers. That's
veggie
right.
Burgers. Now, your mother has been vegan for about 30 years?
Yeah, we went vegetarian we decided to go plant-based when I was about 1 year old. One
1
years
year old.
old.
So was it your decision at the time?
It was my family's decision. I didn't really know, of course. It was always my decision. It was a choice that my parents made together.
When you
That
were 1
was
year old.
when I was 1 years
And
old.
did you weigh in the family discussions on this?
Eventually I did. Eventually
Okay.
I did.
So at 1 year old, you went vegetarian.
That is
But
correct.
but during the first year of your life, little infants don't usually eat a lot of meat. So
That's correct. So
did
I've
you ever have meat?
essentially been vegetarian my whole life, except over a period of time when I didn't really understand. So of course, eating meat was always my choice. My parents never shoved this ideology or this value system down my throat. Um, they let me come to that on my own. And as I mentioned before, mom, she just said, you know, those burgers come from animals, the ones we eat come from plants. It's really your choice. I could order a McDonald's burger if I chose or not. And when I was at friends' houses, I didn't really know. I didn't really understand. I couldn't wrap my head around what it was that I was eating. So of course I did eat meat before recognizing what it was I was contributing to.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at you now and your aura has cleared up. So that's good.
That's right. Yeah.
When was the last time you think you ever ate meat?
I must have been around 7 or 8 years old. And
Okay.
again, it was not recognizing what it was I was doing. I
All right.
recall the moment actually, two moments, and I can't remember which was the last one, but both times I grow ill after eating
Uh-huh.
that food. And it was perhaps I just didn't have the enzymes to digest it or whatever it was.
Uh-huh.
But I threw up and thought, well, this isn't for me. That's for sure.
So you had the advantage of having a mother who knows more about nutrition than just about anyone else in the free world. And on top of that, you were emotionally, um, you know, sensitive to how cruel and foolish it is to eat animals. So you were very lucky on both scores. But when you're growing up and you're a kid and the other kids are, having burgers and having pepperoni pizza or whatever, how did you handle that? What did you say to your friends?
Well, at first I was very amicable about it. And I didn't really say much. I just said, this is, I don't eat those foods. And it's how I grew up. Over time, when I started to rationalize and articulate why it is I am the way I am, I didn't necessarily know how to articulate my empathy that profoundly impacted my core when I learned about this, something that I never wanted to forget or give up. And so I always reflected upon that moment and said, this part of me it's too beautiful to give up, that empathy towards animals. I did go through a period as a teenager where I was more aggressive about my beliefs. And in that time, I recognized that it didn't influence the people in the way that I wanted it to, right? And so over time, I adapted um, to be more amicable towards others with different
Uh-huh.
views or opinions, right?
Uh-huh.
It's not about a blame game or about offending their morality or their ethical stance. It's a collaborative discussion if they want to have it.
Right. But here's where it turns into three-dimensional chess and it gets very tricky. I am temperamentally inclined to feel the way you just expressed that you feel, that it is far better to not be judgmental, to be open, to have a discussion with people and let people, obviously people make their own choices. We can't force them to do anything. And just to follow our own diet and be open to discussing it if people are open to discussing it with us. All that sounds fine, except for one thing, there's a ticking clock.
Right.
You've had fires in Canada. Tell us about those fires, what you believe are causing those fires, and the threat to the planet from the fact that our friends and relatives and so many people we come across are making the mistake of eating a diet that's helping to destroy the planet.
Yeah, thank you. This is a huge topic. What is causing the fires in Canada? And it's certainly multifaceted, certainly multifaceted. So there's the angle that, or there's the one factor that we've mismanaged our forests, perhaps, in planting large plantations of a single species, lodgepole pine, which resulted in a pine beetle epidemic, causing the death of many, many trees. And recently, we also had a spruce beetle epidemic in parts of my province, at least, which makes them susceptible to forest fire, right? At the same time as this is happening, we've experienced some record temperatures and very low levels of precipitation. So why is that? There's a confluence of factors there. And there's other smaller factors in there as well. We've cleared a lot of forest for cattle ranching, for example, which does influence woody growth, encroachment into grassland areas. And so there's all these little other factors going on. But from a broad level, the precipitation and warmer temperatures, of course, are also multifactored. So when we think about the contribution to the global temperature rise or the record-setting temperatures we've experienced here in British Columbia, there's fossil fuels and there's agriculture, probably the two biggest ones. You know, production is huge. And that's tied to GDP, fossil fuels and production. That's a massive impact. Of course, your book, Food is Climate.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really does a great job. You know, I really appreciated the story you told about RAW and Goodland and the FAO. Of course, from a mainstream perspective, animal agriculture contributes 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions, an idea that you thoroughly addressed in your book. I think it's much higher. And I agree, it's at a minimum. But even at a minimum, right, just take the easy position. You know, that's comparable to all the transportation sector. Our personal vehicles, for example, contributes about 8% to climate change, for example. And we hear this big push for us to ride your bike more, use public transportation, etc. But animal agriculture is a huge contributor. Our food system in general is a massive contributor to our climate. And you also do a good job in that book of talking about the opportunity cost of forest loss as a result of that and the potential for carbon sequestration if they were to be rewilded. And I think that's a major impact in terms of that, of climate change, but also precipitation. Also precipitation, because forests contribute to regional water cycles across the world, cross-continental transport of atmospheric moisture through a process called evapotranspiration, whereby trees take by their roots water, absorb it through those roots, and releases it as vapor into the air. And this replenishes regional water cycles across the world, especially in the continental interiors, and especially in the summer when we need it the most. So when I say when I say that there's multiple factors, I'm just scratching the surface on perhaps why we've experienced forest fires in Canada to such an extreme extent. I recall in think it was 2017 or 2018, I was working on the wildfires with the BC Wildfire Service. And I was working on this fire, the North Plateau fire near Quesnel, sort of mid-province. And it was a fire that was about 200,000 hectares in size. And it converged with another fire, the South Plateau fire, which was also about 200,000 hectares in size. And when it combined, it ended up being 500,000 hectares in size, just absolutely massive. When we look at the scale, the ecological cost of perhaps even reclaiming some of those important wildlife habitats, we're looking in the billions of dollars, the cost of these wildfires, not to mention the old growth that was lost, the impact it had to our forestry industry here in BC. The impacts were substantial. Loss of lands used for cultural heritage and cultural practice, traditional practices from Indigenous peoples in the regions, migratory bird habitat, and so on. The impacts were absolutely shocking. But perhaps that's the overview of
well,
a high level.
You mentioned that sometimes the forest is raised in order to graze cattle.
Yeah.
So when you think about that from a climate standpoint, you're chopping down trees that sequester carbon dioxide and that emit water vapor. You're replacing the trees on the land with cows that belch methane and exhale carbon dioxide and degrade the land. So from a climate standpoint, it's just, what they're doing to the Amazon and what we have done to forests around the world is just a disaster for so many reasons. And then the cows often wind up in concentrated animal feeding operations where the manure releases methane and nitrous oxide. And all of these are greenhouse gases that are far, far more powerful than carbon dioxide. The UN, the IPCC tries to find clever ways to discount how powerful methane is, but methane is far more powerful.
That's right.
Than carbon dioxide.
And if I could add to that, you mentioned CAFOs. Some of the cattle do go there. It's actually quite a brilliant business model, right? So everybody knows that factory farms, these concentrated animal feeding operations or CAFOs, are bad. I've yet to met a person who's like, yes, pro factory farm. But there's so many levels to the supply chain before they get there. Of course, the small family ranches, right? In the fall here in British Columbia, they auction off their cattle, these small family-run operations who are oftentimes pillars in their community. There are neighbors, right? There's a culture there with these small ranchers. There's barn dances. It's a culture, and it can't forget that and be sensitive to that. But they auction off their cattle in the fall to very few concentrated animal feeding operations. Put this into perspective, here in British Columbia, about 95% or so of our cattle go to just a few, like maybe 3 concentrated animal feeding operations in Alberta, the next province over. A couple percent go to Washington State. And these are factory farms, and when we criticize the cattle ranching industry, it is the small ranchers that often take the stage, go on to radio news broadcasting, and they're the ones speaking out because it's a threat to their livelihood, something that I can empathize with. But they're selling their cattle to big industry, right? And so they get a blanket, big industry, those CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations, they get a blanket of comfort, a barrier. They get a barrier, a shelter from this conversation, as it's the little guys who come up and take the defense. So it is quite a brilliant business model if you look at it that way. But it's also a business model that straddles the line of profitability. So the cattle ranches, you know, here in British Columbia, at least, they're straddling that line of that profit margin, just straddling it, where small changes in the price of beef, for example, can have major implications for their operation. Many of them are just breaking even. Many of them are seeing losses.
And that's with the help of government subsidies, right?
With the help of governments, on the lifeline of government subsidies,
Yeah.
as I like to put it. So when I campaign for better environmental strategies for cattle ranching, for example, it is a threat to their livelihoods, because those strategies cost money, and that additional cost will push them over that profit margin fairly easily. Perhaps without that support from government funding, it would be a much smaller industry. It would look a lot different than it does today, put it that way.
Right. So when we look at this folly in a global perspective, we are chopping down trees, which are our only hope of saving the climate, in order to graze cattle, which make the climate that much worse, significantly worse, with methane and nitrous oxide and the degrading of the soil. And we do that in order that we can eat the animals and thereby have less food, 1/10 as much food as if we ate the grain directly. And we can give ourselves heart attacks and obesity and cancer and any number of other health problems that come from the folly of eating animals. So it's hard to find any angle in which this makes any kind of sense.
I agree. I concur with you on that. And you raised a good point about, we grow grain and other plants to feed cattle, for example. There's a growing movement of people protesting this, saying that, you know, we feed our cattle grass, right? They're grass-fed cattle for most of their, well, for part of their lives, a year to maybe a year and a half, until they get auctioned off to the CAFOs. Again, not over 95% of the cattle here in British Columbia, at least, they end up at CAFOs. Here in Canada, we feed our cattle. We're famous for feeding them barley. In the States, it's corn, but we also grow a lot of cattle corn up here as well. But let's just take a moment to think about that, the grass-fed beef. Even if it is 100% grass-fed or grass-finished, you know, the rare case, and using this as an excuse or as an argument to continue eating beef, that I only eat grass-fed beef. Well, grass-fed beef here in Canada, because I don't know as much about the state of the US, but here in Canada, there's several kinds of pasture. One is called tame pasture, and it's very common. And this is classified along with field crops. It's kind of wrapped up whenever we do assessment of, say, water use by crop type. Tame pasture is in that category with field crops. Field crops would be things like grains. And tame pasture is a type of pasture that gets irrigated. So they actually irrigate these tame pastures. About 25% of the pastures in British Columbia, we often hear about, you know, ranchers or stewards of the grasslands and so forth. Well, about a quarter of our pastures in Canada are seeded with non-native grass as well. And so we have tame pastures, which irrigate the grass. We have pastures that use non-native grass. And regardless of where they're grazing here in Canada, they are going to consume hay, right? And hay is typically grasses and legumes that, compared with grain are less resource intensive, for sure. They use less pesticides and things, but they still use pesticides. Don't kid yourself. They're still using pesticides on hay fields, and hay fields are actually quite massive. They're easy to grow. So we often see it a lot where hay is actually being grown in areas that aren't really great areas to grow other kinds of crops, and in areas that could be used to grow all kinds of great crops.
Or could be forested?
Or could be forested, yes. And that's a really good point, because a lot of our agricultural land was carved out of old growth. And I think about back where I was born in Ontario and the landscape there, where so much of that old growth forest was carved out to make way for things like wheat and cattle corn. And of course, corn is notoriously nutrient hungry. And so once those soils were depleted, what are they growing now? They're growing hay.
And I'll interrupt to make this point. Isn't it true that the old growth forests would be less susceptible to fire than the replanted forests?
Yep, that is correct. And also, in terms of the replanted forests, when we clear a forest, it has been argued that, we go in and we replant. That's a form of restoring the forest type, right? Some characterize it as a plantation. Now we're being a little bit more climate forward when we replant forests. So we're planting different species in different areas. So you often see a mix now, but it forgoes that successional phase of a forest life. So in the case of a natural disturbance, just say a forest fire goes through a forest naturally, or a landslide or something along those lines that creates a disturbance in our forests, you'll see particular species pop up. You'll see kind of weedy species. You might see flowers. It might look like a meadow, might get blueberries and all kinds of willows and things like that. Then you'll see things like alder will start growing up, deciduous type bushes and trees, small trees, alder, aspen, things like this. You might see cottonwood. And then as the forest starts maturing here in our region, especially, we have a lot of coniferous forests. Then you start to see the conifers start out competing. And this sort of takes place over the course of hundreds of years, right? And some have noted how the alder forests in that successional stage also provides a bit of a fire break. So it's actually quite interesting thinking about our forests as plantations. But getting back to hay, folks often don't realize this because the ranching community often perpetuates this idea that cattle eating grass has these minimal impacts. It's not using a lot of water. We discussed tame pasture. We talked about how a lot of pastures also use invasive, or not invasive, but non-native grasses. Hay is also an irrigated crop. Let's not forget that. Hay is also an irrigated crop, and it's used to feed cattle who are 100% grass finished. Because there are times of the year where there's snow on the ground, where they can't forage for grass, where forage is limited. If forage gets too low, if the stubble heights get too low for the forage, then they're going to start having to eat hay, which is an irrigated crop. It uses cropland, land that could be used to grow other crops, land that could be rewilded, land that could be grasslands. We've lost those grasslands with huge grass heights. So I often hear stories about these huge grass heights up to your waists walking through grasslands. I don't necessarily see that. I don't know if I've ever actually seen that in a large landscape. So I've seen it intermittently. Here in Canada, hay crops, when we compare them to vegetable and fruit crops combined, depending on the amount of precipitation we receive in a year, use anywhere from 3 to 10 times more water than all fruit and vegetable crops combined, not including field crops like potatoes would be a field crop. But I mean, that's a massive amount of water that hay crops alone are using. So that's a huge impact. I just really wanted to make that point.
Yeah. And are the non-native grasses a factor in the fires?
One could assume that there's some influence. Of course, natural grasslands, depending on your area, would see a natural succession of wildfire, perhaps every 17 years, perhaps 30 years, depending on what type of grassland we're talking about. Some ranches have done prescribed burning. So we have seen that to restore some of the vegetation growth. So we have seen that. But oftentimes they're protected, right? It's a piece of infrastructure. It is a piece of infrastructure. And it's funny because depending on the environmental management strategies they're using on a particular range or a particular pasture, it could look different, the impacts to wildfire susceptibility or changes in ecological communities that could increase or decrease the risk of wildfire. Of course, there's been a lot of back and forth about cattle and the encroachment of woody plants into the grasslands. And I've seen the argument go both ways.
Yeah, I remember hearing that in the horrific fire on Maui, that non-native grasses were a factor.
I'll have to look into that. Yeah, I'm not necessarily aware of that instance.
So in your role as an agrologist, do you find that you have any effect on land use? Who do you consult with?
I certainly think so.
Okay, tell us about that.
So my work as an agrologist has ranged across several different disciplines, from thinking about cattle ranching and the management practices, the impacts on First Nations, Indigenous communities in my area. And perhaps that one is the one that tugged at my heartstrings the most, to the management of natural disasters, right? So that is also part of the environmental conservation motif, or my specialization in agrology. I tend to look at things from a big picture lens, right? And so oftentimes I go around, I gave a presentation on watershed security the other day. I do things like that. So I like to think of myself as someone who knows a little bit about a lot, but doesn't know a lot about a little bit in the work I do. So I'm being an agrologist. I'm not the soil science expert. I'm not an expert in a whole lot, but I am, when we zoom out in terms and think about land use planning. And I've had in my career the privilege to be able to weave together my educational background, which does involve academic sciences, applied sciences, and the social sciences. I've had this beautiful opportunity to weave them together and think about and engage with people about the socioeconomic impacts of the food we eat to a wide range of underrepresented communities, which has given me a bit of a different perspective when I speak about environmental impacts. Sometimes it sounds differently than how some of my colleagues might characterize them. You know, I appreciate in your book, the preface was Philip Wallen. Is that how you pronounce Wallen?
Yes.
Talks about Carl Sagan's Blue Planet turned into a bloodstained slaughterhouse, I believe.
Yeah.
But it does a really good job of sort of zooming out the Voyager 1 spacecraft, looking at the tiny pinhole that is planet Earth. So poetic and enchanting. And I really love how it zoomed out in space and resolution here. It's very powerful. What I also like to do is zoom out in time. And your book, Food is Climate, does a great job of detailing the impacts of climate change and livestock, from direct emissions to the opportunity costs of forest loss, which accelerated in recent decades and maybe is slowing down a little bit in some areas. But perhaps we could talk about it from a bit of a different angle. You know, America is a really precious place, you know, where Europeans, the influence of Europeans only existed for hundreds of years, not thousands. You know, upon the arrival by the Spanish in the 1500s, disease spread through indigenous populations. And the colonial lens from the British Isles, for example, observed and painted a picture of what the North American landscape was and the people therein was through that lens. You know, 90% of indigenous peoples were wiped out. We're living in a post-apocalyptic time. Disease did not just strike the elderly and the sick or the vulnerable, but the young and the strong. And many examples of young, strong, healthy chiefs, for example, succumbed to illness. Cultures were wiped out, governance structures shattered, communities crumbled. One can only imagine the kind of fear and desperation and tragedy that pervaded the nations at that time. And sociological studies show that even minor structural shifts within a community could lead to significant societal issues. Such changes can heighten the risk of substance abuse, escalate domestic violence, and increase crime rates, thereby undermining the very qualities that would contribute to a community's resilience. And at these junctures of heightened vulnerability, communities were also more susceptible to cultural assimilation, with dominant cultures potentially eroding very unique identities. And it's important that we don't generalize indigenous peoples because so many unique, beautiful cultures.
Have you worked with indigenous peoples?
Yeah.
Tell us about that. What kind of work did you do with indigenous peoples?
So I have in the past, well, I worked with indigenous peoples of the Marshall Islands on the diabetes wellness program, but also worked deeply with indigenous peoples here in Canada, or the lands that we now call Canada and Turtle Island, engaging with them on impacts from all kinds of natural resource development, from cattle ranching, for sure. When cattle use public lands here in British Columbia, we call it the range, to mining, to forestry, to all kinds of, to windmill development, to all kinds of things, those kinds of impacts. And it's which gave me perhaps a unique, I don't know if it's necessarily a unique lens. Somebody once asked me, where am I from? It's hard for me to answer because I've lived in so many different places. I've probably on average lived in a place for about 3 years at a time. Right? My perspective of the land is certainly fleeting. Someone told me perspective of the land is fleeting. I have no idea what it's like to have intergenerational knowledge of a place, the kind of knowledge that comes over hundreds of years. I think this is a really important concept. Excuse me, of deep knowledge of a place over time. I've told it, I've told this story a few times. Maybe I'll tell it again because I just find it so powerful. It was very impactful on my perspective. A colleague of mine, an indigenous colleague of mine, once told me a story about how he and his father used to hunt for grouse in ptarmigan in the grasslands, and the grasslands would be rustling with ground birds. He said it's a lively place, but not so much anymore. However, he said his grandfather would talk about flocks of ptarmigan and grouse in the grasslands in greater numbers than he ever knew. And I told this story to natural resource professionals and was met with, well, Indigenous people, they always say that kind of thing. There's no evidence for that. Grasslands, by the way, they're incredible. They provide incredible ecosystem services, including groundwater recharge and discharge, erosion reduction, flood mitigation, fish habitat, wildlife habitat, water quality improvement, traditional Indigenous foods, and much more. Well, reflecting upon that story, I also read The Condor's Shadow, authored by the ecologist David S. Wilkove, whom I deeply, deeply admire. And he recounts in this book his early days of bird watching, when seasoned elder bird watchers, senior bird watchers, lamented that the vibrancy of the spring migrations had diminished since the spring migration just wasn't what it used to be, they would say. Initially, he chalked it up to memory loss, old age. He didn't really believe that the spring migration was so much more robust than he observed. Well, later on, he realized, decades on, that he also witnessed the same thing. He began to echo their words that the spring migration just wasn't what it used to be. The richness of spring migrations had indeed waned. And the experience of bird watching for the youth today, the kids going out for their bird watching adventures today, they'll never know what the spring migration was when David S. Wilkove was a kid, and Wilkove will never know what it was like when the old timers were kids.
Right.
That experience will differ greatly from the generations before. He identifies this phenomenon as generational amnesia, which he believes is a significant barrier to cultivating persistent, effective land ethic in America, or conservation ethic in America, contrary to being dismissed as typical ecological rhetoric, like my Indigenous friend was accused of, or when I shared that story of the waning populations of grouse and ptarmigan in the grassland. By the way, those are ground nesting birds. Ground nesting bird habitat gets very much reduced with grazing pressure. So you can find charts online. The lower the grass height, the less nesting bird habitat there is, of course.
Sure.
So it wasn't dismissed. You know, Wilkove, by the way, with these stories and his books and his science, he's recognized with prestigious accolades, including Pioneer of Science Award, a Publication of the Year Award, solidifying his reputation as a scientist. And this narrative, it really resonates with me. It highlights our collective tendency to lose historical ecological benchmarks.
Well, this concept of generational amnesia applies to health as well. When I was a kid, there weren't other kids with what used to be called adult onset diabetes. When I was a kid, there wasn't so much obesity. This is in my lifetime that I've seen obesity go from, I don't know, maybe 5% of the population to 40%. But there's generational amnesia because the kids growing up now, it's normal to them.
That's right.
It's normal to see, young people at college, half of whom are overweight or obese. And they don't know how odd this is historically. They don't know how odd this is across populations throughout history. There was never a population like this before.
That's right.
That's eating.
Some might characterize this as picture frame syndrome. If you could imagine a chart with many peaks and troughs, you take a picture frame of one peak or one trough, and you characterize the situation from that piece of data, right? And I think this narrative might, or this thread that we're talking about here of generational amnesia and picture frame syndrome ties back into ranching for sure. You know, back to my fleeting perspective of the land, you know, my understanding of the land is ephemeral, I would say, just recognizing my own bias. You know, I've come to unconsciously accept the current state as the only reality I know, which becomes my baseline for comparison. This kind of underscores the importance of recognizing the land's history as we experience today, which is why I really like to reflect on the past, right? To try and shatter that bias I have, that many people have. And scientists refer to this phenomenon as shifting baseline syndrome. It's a concept that was actually introduced to me by a biologist, Ross Peterson, an elder whom I deeply respect. He's the one who invited me to give that lecture on watershed security at an elder college, engaging with our elders who hold so much priceless knowledge. Well, the concept of shifting baseline syndrome refers to the tendency of new generations to perceive the environmental conditions they encounter as the norm. And as the natural world undergoes progressive change, declines, this syndrome leads to a gradual acceptance of increasingly degraded environmental states. And this has serious implications, as it can lead to the establishment of flawed standards for the conservation, restoration, and overall management of natural habitats. It's a troubling observation that our society seems to have marginalized our elders, who have historically served as custodians and conveyors of knowledge, as well as storytellers. And today, our cultural practices often strip these individuals of that significant role. There's just a wealth of wisdom and narratives at risk of being lost as biases between generations continue to pervade our thought. But shifting baseline, it's those stories, the story of David S. Wilcove, you know, that shifting baseline of more robust spring migrations being degraded over time and dismissing what the elders said until he experienced it himself, I think is a really important story. Step by step, we've simplified rangelands, for example, when contrasted to the complex biodiverse ecosystems teeming with wildlife that once thrived here. I cannot tell you how many times I've been told stories about the loss of culturally valuable traditional food plants, medicinal plants, ecological change that has occurred where the cattle roam. And these are current changes. But this has been well known from early on. Like in the 1940s, Aldo Leopold wrote several papers about the impacts of cattle ranching in riparian areas. Notably, in his book, The Sound County Almanac, he talks about the impact of cattle ranching on ecosystems, albeit briefly. He talks about how where cattle graze, the silphium plant, a yellow flower, won't grow, right? But they will grow where bison graze. They'll even grow where dirt roads are. And he thought this was because cattle would graze over a particular area over and over. Cattle are confined, whereas bison might graze heavily one area, intensely one area, but then they move on, not coming back for vast amounts of time. They travel very long distances before they come back, which perhaps is why there's a promotion of rotational grazing today, trying to mimic those natural grazing patterns of wild
I tend to
herbivores a little
think
bit
that
better.
the promotion of rotational grazing is a last ditch attempt to find some way to justify and make a place for animal agriculture. This idea that we're going to have regenerative animal agriculture, and we're going to rotate the cattle from paddock to paddock before we ship them off to the same slaughterhouses as the CAFO cattle.
Yes, rotational grazing isn't perfect. I do think it's better ecologically than overgrazing because it gives time for a
if it,
particular grassland to rebound a little bit. However,
right,
there's
if
still
it were
fences,
sustainable,
right?
if
There's
it were
still fences
yeah, and if
and
it were
roads.
sustainable, because what percentage of of Canadian consumers are buying regeneratively grown meat? And if they were all buying regeneratively grown meat, how much forest would be left? Right?
That's true. I wouldn't necessarily equate rotational grazing with regenerative grazing per se.
Okay, tell us the
They
difference.
could both be part of the same system. Well, that's part of the problem. There is no accepted definition of regenerative agriculture, let
Right.
alone regenerative grazing. And depending on the region and the ecological community you find yourself in and the local climates, it might look different from place to place. I am certainly not a believer in regenerative grazing, but I do think if we're solely focused on environmental benchmarks, improvements are better. Improvements are definitely better. They're not the solution, though. They're
Right.
not the solution.
And here's my argument with regenerative grazing. There's something almost elitist about it. At least in the States, I think it's 1% of our beef is grass-fed or regenerative, one or the other. 99% is conventionally raised. So when I hear people say, "Oh, I would never touch that CAFO meat. I get my regeneratively grazed meat." Well, if everybody did that, there's nothing there. We need 3 more planets. So there's something kind of elitist about it. And the only way to feed this many people this much meat is using CAFOs. There's also the fact that the cattle live longer, take longer to reach their so-called finishing weight when they're grass-fed or regeneratively raised, and so they're belching more methane for more years. And in general, the grass-fed cattle belch more methane than the grain-fed. So it's just, it's a false solution to the problem. The easy solution is eat the plant burgers that Cory eats, that
I
his mother
agree.
fed him when he was a child. That's it. Were they delicious, Cory?
They were amazing.
Yeah, there you
Amazing.
go.
I didn't know any different. And actually, my best friend, I won't say his name, but my best friend at the time, he would come over to our house. He was staunch meat eater. His family of hunters, fishers. He would come over to our house all the time, and he had no idea that the Eve's deli meat of the 90s, which of course is incomparable to the veggie meats you could get today.
Right.
He had no idea. He had no idea that what he was eating was vegetarian. And when he found out, he was absolutely shocked. He
Just
was
like you were
absolutely
shocked by
shocked and angry, perhaps
you
even a little bit, that he had been eating plant-based foods all this time without his knowledge, without his consent. One thing. You talked about something very important about the capacity to produce grass-fed beef or regenerative beef and so forth. And there's been studies about this. And models, people have actually modeled the trends of livestock farming and where it's going. And there certainly has been this trend of moving from a pastoral type system to an industrialized system. And there's even been models, and I'm thinking about Robin Reed's paper, which is probably about 10 years old now, which did some models about this, and linking it back to biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And what they saw in both their models was that Robin Reed wasn't the only author of the paper. I'm just blanking out who else wrote it. But yeah, what they found was that the industrialization of agriculture, moving from pastoral to more industrialized versions, is going to be correlated with further biodiversity loss as we move on. There's just no two ways around it. Right. Just as you said, there's ecological constraints, there's land constraints that are not amenable to expanding the pastoral version of animal agriculture that the beef industry props up, this pastoral form, and characterizes the industry as a whole by it. And it's easy to do that because of that brilliant business model. All we see are our neighbors, our ranchers, who might have small operations of 50 cattle, 100 cattle. There's operations with 500. There's much larger operations out there. But oftentimes at the forefront, the ones that we see, with the mother and the daughters riding the horses, herding a couple dozen cattle down the road, that's what we see. And it's easy to empathize with an industry like that because of who it is that's at that step in the supply chain. And then further up along the supply chain, it gets more and more out of sight and out of mind, more and more behind closed doors into those AFOs, as you mentioned.
Yeah,
which
it's
the vast majority of cows.
It's easy to empathize with people in the animal agriculture business in general because they often were brought up in this field. They are hardworking, decent people. They have been told that animal protein is superior and they're providing a service for people, and they've been misled. And,
right.
you know, we just all need to help them get into a better line of work.
Thank you for that. Because
some
of my best friends, some of my most favorite people are cattle ranchers who are so people focused, you know, such soft souls who, if a person is injured or suffers a traumatic event, they're the first to be at your side and comfort you. Just some really wonderful people out there. So I don't like to characterize ranchers as, you know, these awful people or anything like that, but recognizing the industry as a whole and what it's doing to our planet is a sensitive topic, but it's a story, an epic story that needs to be told. And it really, you know, Glenn, it's a really epic story. You know, if we want to go far back enough to the Neolithic era, 11,000 years ago, when all of this started to transpire and made these relationships with animals, some characterize that relationship as symbiotic. I don't necessarily think so. You know, you provide just enough that animals will stay in your peripheral vicinity. But in the end, it's, you know, so you could harvest their flesh pelts for food and clothing, which reduced the amount of hunting you needed to do, right? And so it kind of evolved out of that. And in Europe, I mean, a while ago in our conversation, I talked about how, you know, the European mindset sort of came over and made this transformation in North America. At least I was trying to get there. But that culture and that mode of existence evolved over thousands of years in Europe. When we think about even 5,000 years ago, when there was started to see the impacts of prescribed burning, what it did to, perhaps even increase the fire resistance of oak. About 4,000 years ago, deforestation started to accelerate to make way for pasture and agricultural lands. The impacts that we think about 60% of Europe has been deforested, which was largely wooded and intact. And over that period of time, there was massive amounts of extinctions. By the 1600s, for example, the European reindeer extinct, wolves by the 1700s in the British Isles were extinct, the beaver was extinct in many areas, copper butterfly, many insects, reptiles, birds. There was a whale that went extinct. There was just massive ecological change in wildlife communities that resulted by the agricultural expansion that throughout the Holocene epoch, I guess one could say. But by the 1600s, when folks from the British Isles started to come to North America, wildlife resources were drastically depleted in Europe, like beaver pelts. Beavers, by the way, made a really great functional hat, right? It would keep its shape after being wet, right? And when they came to the Americas, of course, disease killed 90% of indigenous peoples here. And there was millions of them here. I think there was 50 million indigenous peoples perhaps in the Americas. And all those pressures of hunting and prescribed burning that occurred here had dropped substantially, which created a rebound of wildlife and vegetation. So wildlife perhaps existed at in artificial abundance, I guess I would say. And that created in the minds of the Europeans a perspective about what the Americas were. They thought of this artificial abundance of wildlife resources as something that was just natural here. But of course, it was a temporary ecological change from the dramatic decline in indigenous populations, and they capitalized on that. And there was a massive bloodbath that would ensue across the Americas, where billions of animals were slaughtered every year. I mean, the passenger pigeon went extinct, millions of pronghorn, bison, moose, you name it, was slaughtered. Sometimes for no good reason, like many of the passenger pigeons, just shooting for fun, mostly for economic incentive. And it's a cultural inertia that still persists to this day. Of course, what we see is a product of the past. Everything's been built upon that. And many of the folk heroes of the past that we think of, they were massive hunters, right? Like, and I think some of the names, and I just can't off the top of my head, but many would kill hundreds of bears and things like that. And was a prestige for them. In the 1700s, I think just in 1 year, we exported over 100,000 beaver pelts to Europe. And there was a point at which beavers in America were almost extinct. They were threatened of extinction at one point in America. And you could see there's, some of the most early ecologists of the day would tell the story of the changing ecosystems that resulted. Of course, beavers are incredible ecosystem engineers that evolved with the ecosystems here in America. And as a result, they would create lots of wetlands, which would store vast amounts of water across the landscape. And once their populations were in decline, those wetlands failed. And water that would be held on the land was fast-tracked to the oceans, creating incredible amounts of erosion along rivers, changing the landscape of North America, which was once a very watery world. Just one example of how animal exploitation has terraformed North America in a sense. There's a historian, John Douglas Belshaw, and his book is available online for free. I can't remember the name of it, but if you look up his name, you'll find his open access book. And he talks about how there's a quote, and maybe I could actually find it. If I actually found it really impactful. If I could actually quote him, that would be fantastic.
All right, we're searching for a quote now. And give us his name again.
John Douglas Belshaw.
And
So,
Belshaw is spelled B-E-L?
S-H-A-W. Yeah, and the book is Canadian History Post-Confederation. And I really like the way he describes it here. He says, one of the more subtle features of colonialism is the way in which it creates environments that favor newcomers over natives. European societies effectively terraformed North America to make it more amenable to their familiar and preferred food sources. By doing so, the kinds of animals and plants on which innumerable generations of Aboriginal peoples survived were reduced, removed, or eliminated. Bison herds, salal berries, camas roots, and many other resources were chased off, burned away, or plowed under to make way for beef cattle, strawberries, and potatoes.
Well, that epic story, as you call it, of land use change to accommodate animal agriculture is ongoing, of course. And you have in your book, Plant-Powered Protein, which you co-authored with Brenda Davis and Visanto Molina, you have a chart of how much plant protein and animal protein is being produced and eaten in countries around the world over time. And what we see is that over the last 40, 50 years, in many nations, the plant protein has only barely increased, sometimes even gone down, and the animal protein has gone way up. There's a destructive trend all over the world. Do you see any hope of this reversing?
I think I do. I certainly do. I think that it is imperative and it's going to become necessary to simplify our agricultural system out of environmental necessity, for one, but also shifting values. Like we mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned, like, I haven't met anybody who's super pro CAFO.
Right.
You know, nobody's saying, yes, I love factory farms and what they do to animals. You always hear that's awful. Everybody wants to eat the more ethical choice. I think that's something that I latch onto and it gives me hope, for sure. And I think individuals have power. I mean, you know, let's think about the power that people have. I know there's a lot of narratives out there that shift the blame to industries, you know, the entities that profit off of environmental destruction. And there's responsibility there, a lot of it. I put a lot of responsibility on the animal agricultural lobbyists. But let's not forget that many regular people have their money with financial planners or invested in these industries and also profit off of it. And they only profit off of environmental destruction when individuals pay for it. Let's not forget that consumers do have power. Gandhi once said, you know, be the change you want to see. And I believe that philosophy. I'm trying to think of, there's another quote, the CEO of 23andMe, Anne Wojcicki, yes, said something along the lines of change only comes when you lead by example. And that's the reality. I can't remember the exact quote. So that's just a characterization of her quote. But I mean, that is powerful to me. Glenn, after reading your book, Food is Climate, it inspired me. You've had profound impact on me, not to mention I tried your white pizza sauce, which I loved, in the lo mein noodles. So definitely the recipes were to die for, but individuals have power. You know, the narrative that we don't is effectively disempowering. It dismisses the power individuals have had in the past revolutions. Our actions matter. And in terms of what we eat, you know, an individual who removes animal products from their diet uses 75% less land than someone who consumes a meat-rich diet.
And I suspect it's more than that.
Yeah, probably more than that. Generates 75% less water pollution. But, you know, also the average American, for example, eats 174 sentient, thinking, feeling, dreaming individuals every year. Our individual impact on the lives of those creatures matters very much to them. It matters to the hearts and minds of those like you and me who empathize and grieve for those animals. I think we do have impact. I think people will realize that. And I think it's going to be out of necessity that our agricultural system becomes more sustainable. And to be more sustainable, it will require eating less meat and potentially even phasing it out almost entirely in an industrial sense.
Yeah. Well, this brings us full circle to the point we were addressing much earlier in our conversation, which was both you and I have an inclination to not be confrontational, to not be strident, to not, not go around carrying signs that say meat is murder, to respect other people's choices. But we have a ticking clock on the environment. Animal agriculture is the leading cause of climate change. I never used to evangelize for the vegan diet. I was just doing it for my own well-being. But now I feel the need to make other people change, to encourage other people to change. So how do you find yourself dealing with other people if you're at a, I don't know, with a bunch of friends who are, who want to get the fried chicken, or if you're, in an office environment where people are ordering the pepperoni pizza, do you say nothing? Do you say something? How do you deal with it? How do you try to help affect the vegan transformation that we need to see?
I love that question. What I do is I like to share food, for one. So no, I don't call anybody out if they're ordering meat or anything. What I want to do is I want to normalize eating a vegan diet, a plant-based diet. And the way to normalize it is not position yourself. Think about it as you're trying to market veganism. So what you want to do is you don't want to position yourself as being on the fringe by attacking what others eat or pointing it out or doing something drastically different. What you want to do is normalize your behavior. And so when I go out with friends, I just amicably go about and eat plant-based food. And I try and order food that I think others would probably like and be like, oh, that looks good. You know, perhaps if that looks good, they're going to order it next time. And that's going to be one meal that they don't eat with an animal on their plate. And maybe that will inspire them to create a dish similar at their own home. One thing I do is I don't eat out often, but I like to have people over for food. And so I always try to tailor the food I eat to the taste buds of my friends and family and so forth. So my in-laws actually stayed with me for the past year. They're trying to get permanent residents here in Canada. They're from China, and they are, big meat eaters. Eating meat is a sign of cultural status. And so when they were showing pictures of the food I was making them to their friends, sometimes their friends would say, oh, there's no meat. What are you, poor? Things like that. But I always catered to their taste buds. I found out what they liked and I started making them foods that I knew they would love. I knew they would love.
What sorts of foods in this case?
What sort of foods? So I would make them artichoke dips and I would make them vegan pizza, like all homemade stuff, things like that. Food I knew they would love. And over time, they grew to love that. Now, we ate a vegan dinner together every single day. And they always looked forward to the food I made them. And it became normalized. Not once did I say, oh, your meat is, I don't like that you eat meat. It's unethical and, it's environmentally destructive. I think that would have put up their defenses, and there'd be this defense mechanism that goes up that would create an additional barrier to me breaking through to them or changing their behavior in some way. So I just made sure I tried to normalize it. And by the end of the year, they said, I think we're going to take this tradition of eating vegan dinners or eating vegan one day or one meal a day at least back home. I mean, how impactful is that? I think that's pretty darn impactful. They also came to see the disconnection, a small film that a guy named Frank made out of Vancouver, which is a really impactful 10-minute documentary about our relationship with animals. And I gave a little speech there at the film premiere. And I think that inspired them a little bit too. It was their choice. I didn't say you have to come here, like this is going to change your life. They wanted to come and see me speak. They don't speak English, by the way. So they had their Google Translate on. But I think things like that are quite impactful. There was also, some studies done at universities just about, it's kind of along the same path of normalizing veganism or plant-based diets, where they made, at a couple of universities, they made serving plant-based foods the default option. So if you go to order a burger, it's a plant-based burger. And you have to say, swap it out for a meat burger if you want to eat the meat burger. So it was the normal option. And 80% of students opted for the plant-based option because it was normalized.
Right.
Right. So I think that there's a lot of power there if you want to take the pragmatic approach. And I'm of the philosophy that there's all kinds of approaches that work, and no approach, like my strategy, probably alone isn't going to do what I want it to do. So I need a landscape of all these different strategies working out there that might influence people differently at different levels of society in different ways. This is one that I found impactful in my life and in my circles is to really try to normalize my behavior and not make myself out to be fringe, or not go out to dinner with friends because, there's potentially a bit of something that I might not know is in a meal or something like that. I want them to perceive my life as something that is easy, exciting, tasty. My lifestyle is all those things, I think. And I want to share that with people. I don't want to put up any barriers unnecessarily to their access to even changing their lifestyle slightly, like moving the needle in the right way.
All right, Cory Davis, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. The book, again, is Plant-Powered Protein. I see you've got a copy too.
Please, and there's lots of really great recipes in
Yes.
here. I love the peanut noodle salad. There's the tofu fingers. One of my go-to is the chickpea smash. I love that. So check it out. Check out chapter 5, the chapter on the environment. There's a couple chapters that take the environment into account, and of course the recipes. Right. And Glenn, I love the recipes in your book as well. So if your listeners don't have a copy of that, pick that one up and pick up Plant-Powered Protein while you're at it.
And there's also a great deal of information about nutrition and protein from your
yes,
mother.
if I could just make the plug, So I still get asked, where do you get your protein? It's the age-old question that this
Yeah.
book is the definitive book to put an end to the question, where do you get your protein? So if you want that in your arsenal, please pick up Plant-Powered Protein by two of my greatest heroes, Vasanto Molina and Brenda Davis.
Yes. Well, again, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Everyone, please subscribe and post comments, and we'll see you next time. This has been the Glenn Mercer Show, where everyone listening turns vegan, regains their health, and annoys their friends and relatives. Find us on YouTube at The Glenn Mercer Show and across all your major podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe.